And do you see this Nature Medicine article entitled "A SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence"?
Yes.
Were you familiar with this article when it was published in 2015?
I was not familiar with it when it was published in 2015.
When did you first become aware of it?
I believe, again, I read a lot of articles. I believe it was brought to my attention in the context of questions that were raised by members of Congress about experiments that were funded by the NIAID.
So would that have been around 2021 timeframe, do you know, when you first became aware of it?
It certainly was after the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak.
How long after the beginning would you estimate?
I don't recall.
Would it have been right at the beginning of the outbreak, or months into it, or years into it?
You know, years is where we are right now, so it wouldn't have been years. So it likely would have been several months, though I'm not 100% certain.
And so, who are the last two authors listed on the top there?
Well, one is Ralph Baric, who I believe is a scientist at North Carolina, who is a long-term grantee of NIAID.
Do you know Ralph Baric?
Not really. I know who he is. I doubt if I've ever met him. I may have met him at one of the meetings where there are thousands of scientists saying hi to each other, but I know who he is. He's a scientist at University of North Carolina.
And he's funded by NIAID?
He is.
But you don't remember ever meeting him in person?
Again, I don't recall. I could have met him. Again, I run into several thousands of scientists that we refer to, but I don't recall certainly having a relationship with him.
How about the person that listed immediately before him, listed here as Zhongli Shi? Do you know who that is?
I believe, if I'm correct, that this is a scientist who is at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I believe. I'm not 100% certain. I get sometimes confused with Asian names, but I believe this is the person who is a scientist at the Wuhan Institute.
And are you aware generally that there's someone called Shi Zhongli who's been described in the media as the bat woman who does research on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute?
Is that her? I don't know if that's the same person. Like I said, when you're dealing with Asian names, sometimes the first name is last and the last name is first. So sure. I believe this is a person from Wuhan.
Have you ever met that person before?
To my knowledge, I haven't. I'm fairly certain I have not. I could possibly, again, have run into her at one of the many scientific meetings that occur, but I don't specifically recall ever personally running into her.
Can I direct your attention to the beginning of the pandemic, or at least the beginning of the outbreak? Do you remember when you first became aware that there was an outbreak of a new coronavirus in China?
It was either December 31st or the first couple of days of the new year of 2020. So it was either December the 31st of 2019 or the first couple of days of 2020.
Do you recall at some point anybody raising concerns to you in January of 2020 at the beginning of the outbreak, or near the beginning of the outbreak, that the virus might have been genetically engineered or originated in a laboratory?
There was a phone call in late January of 2020, I believe from Jeremy Farrar. There was one other person on the phone, I believe it was Christian Anderson, who piped me in on a three-way call saying that they looked at the virus and there was some concern about the molecular configuration or makeup of the virus that made them think there was a possibility that there could have been a manipulation of the virus.
Before that, had anyone raised a concern like that to you?
To my recollection, no.
How about Robert Redfield? Who's he?
Robert Redfield, at the time, was the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Did he call you in mid-January 2020 and raise that kind of concern about whether or not the virus originated from nature or in a laboratory?
To my recollection, no. I know that Bob today talks about that. I don't recall back in January of 2020 whether Bob was involved or not in any discussion about the manipulation of the virus.
Are you aware of if there's any relationship between Peter Daszak and Shi Zhongli, the two co-authors of that study I showed you in Exhibit 4? Do they work together, or what's your understanding of that?
Objection, calls for speculation, vague, ambiguous.
Could you repeat the question?
Do you know whether there's a working relationship between Shi Zhongli and Peter Daszak?
Well, I do know now, I didn't know it at the time, but I do know now that EcoHealth has a sub-award from their original grant that goes to Shi Zhongli at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So they work together on research that's funded directly by NIAID.
Yeah, the funding goes to EcoHealth, which awards a sub-award. To my knowledge and recollection, it is a 5-year grant of somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000. I believe it averages about $120,000 to $130,000 a year for a 5-year period.
Do you know whether Peter Daszak has access to, for example, the genomes of viruses that Shi Zhongli has generated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Objection, mischaracterizes evidence. I mean,
I just asked him if he knows.
Well,
do you know?
You're assuming evidence not on the record.
I'm just asking him do you know that?
Again, repeat the question. I want to make sure I give you an accurate answer.
Do you know whether Peter Daszak has access or is in possession of data generated by Shi Zhongli pursuant to their research together, including the genomes of coronaviruses?
I don't know absolutely for sure, but I would imagine that if Peter Daszak is collaborating scientifically with Shi Zhongli, that it is likely, given the norms of scientific collaboration, that he would have access to data if they were indeed collaborating, which it looks like, from what I have learned subsequently, that they are collaborators, since he has a sub-award to the Wuhan Institute that I believe goes to Dr. Shi.
Would it be ordinary practice for someone in his position to have access to her data when he's funding her essentially through sub-awards?
That would not be unusual and probably likely.
Can I give you Exhibit 5? We're pre-marking them. If you look at the top there, there's someone sending an email to you and Jennifer Routh called Greg Folkers. Who's Greg Folkers?
Greg Folkers is a member of my inner office. He's my immediate chief of staff in my office group.
And then who's Jennifer Routh?
She's a member of our communications staff.
And then directly below her on the CC line, who's Courtney Billett?
She is the director of the Office of Communication, Legislative Affairs, and Government Outreach.
And if you look at all these people on that in the CC line, are they all within your kind of, I think you described it as your inner office?
Yes, they are in the immediate office of the director.
And it looks like the attachment was talking points for NIAID Director Dr. Fauci.
Right.
Would that be a common thing for your chief of staff to do, to prepare talking points for you when you're going to a press appearance or something like that?
That would be a not unusual thing if I was going to whatever, a meeting or a congressional briefing or what have you, and a subject was brought up that I was not particularly familiar with, that my staff would put together talking points to at least update or inform me about what the meeting was about and things that I should know about it.
If you look in the body of the email, that kind of second paragraph that begins also hyphen, 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 do you see that?
Wait a minute. Where are we now? I'm sorry.
Kind of very close to the top. Second kind of text cluster begins also when talking about COV, not necessarily in this venue. Do you see that?
No, I'm really sorry. Hold on. It's, as a placeholder, looks good. That's the first paragraph. Also, okay, when talking. I got it. Okay.
And Mr. Folker says to you, we have on our team, and then in parentheses, Vincent and folks we fund, Peter Daszak, Ralph Baric, Ian Lipkin, etc., probably the world's experts on non-human coronaviruses. You see that?
Right.
Do you know what he meant when he said that those people are on your team? Did he mean that you fund them, or what is he talking about?
I think he means, I'm speculating. I don't recall this email of January 27th, 2020, but my speculation is that what Mr. Folkers was referring to were people that were either in our group or that we know and are colleagues of ours, because, I mean, Peter Daszak, we've already mentioned, is a grantee. Ralph Baric is a grantee. Ian Lipkin is a scientist at the Columbia School of Public Health. I believe Vincent, though I don't know, could possibly be Vincent Munster, who is a scientist who's employed by NIAID, and I believe that's what Mr. Folkers was referring to when he was saying, when talking about COVID, these are people who are well-versed in that area.
Do you know Ian Lipkin?
I do.
Is he a grantee of...
I believe he is. I mean, he is a well-established scientist in New York City at the Columbia School. I believe it's the Mailman School of Public Health.
Two paragraphs down, it says, NIAID has funded Peter's group, referring to Mr. Daszak, for coronavirus in China for the past 5 years through understanding the risk of bat coronavirus emergence, correct? Yeah. With a grant number.
Yes, I see that.
And that, I take it, would be the grant that we referred to earlier in Exhibit 2 with the same title, Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence.
Objection calls for speculation.
I'm looking at Exhibit number 2, and the title is Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence. And that is the quote that is here, and the grant number is 1R01.
Let me ask you this. Do you remember? I don't need to hear the grant number. Can I just ask you?
Well, I'm trying to make sure that I'm referring to give you a correct answer, which is the question you asked me. Is this referring to this? And it looks like the grant numbers match and the titles match. So my answer to your question is yes.
Do you recall?
I believe they're referring to it. Yeah.
Do you recall?
Counsel, I just would ask to let the witness fully respond before cutting them off.
Do you recall that grant being placed on your radar screen on January 27th of 2020?
Based on this email, it looks like Mr. Folkers at least mentioned it, but that I wouldn't characterize that as being, quote, put on my radar screen to the point of garnering my precise attention to it. Let me finish reading the email. It says, that's now been renewed with a focus to identify cohorts of people exposed to bats in China and work out if they're getting sick from COVID. Eric Stemme is the program officer, and the collaborators include the Wuhan Institute and Ralph. The results of the work. I think this likely was a situation where when the idea of an outbreak in China was brought up with the coronavirus, that my staff thought it would be important for me to understand just the kind of things we were doing. And I think the important sentence in here, which is relevant, is that the grant wanted to identify cohorts of people exposed to bats in China. And the reason for that is wanting to see if there was the possibility of spillover of bat viruses to humans that might or might not be related to SARS-CoV-2. I believe that was the intent of this briefing talking points, if I'm not mistaken.